Hi to Nursing 313 class, Dr. Hastings here. As I'd stated last week, since our time was so limited on day one of class, I thought I would do just a quick overview, this is quick, for psychobiology in groups for the material that arguably would take over an hour for me to present, but was done in about 20 minutes. So in all that, just reinforcing a few themes basically for two brief video links that I'll have on the website that you must have obtained because you're looking at me now. Okay, psychobiology. So the key things for this, from our perspective, was that we need to understand a little bit about neuroanatomy, okay, and a basic organization. But the big theme here, okay, the actual work of the brain is done in the cerebrum, and we're thinking about the way in which individuals are able to process information, okay, and some of that is in discrete areas of the brain where that occurs better. But the cerebrum is important, and the limbic system, a diffuse part of a series of structures, okay, is really critical for our understanding, cognition, and processing of emotion. So important for psychiatric nursing, in effect. Now, the other structures we're referring to all have functions, obviously, in terms of sensory processing, in terms of basic physiological functions. So hence, as on this slide, the basic review of the nervous system. So this is just a picture depicting, apologies if some of the video is covering some of that. Refer back to your original notes. Just a different picture to sort of see that organization, and the color coding helps you see things better. So frontal lobe, particularly critical for us relative to, again, cognition and emotional processing. All right, so within all this, you can see without the color coding approximately where these structures are. You think about the way in which all those cooperate with different aspects of functioning then as well. Now, with those basal functions, what's important relative to the lower brain systems, such as basal ganglia and extrapyramidal tracts, the reason we bring this up in the slide is that this could be affected by some medications that are used to treat psychiatric conditions. Okay, we'll later talk about extrapyramidal symptoms, or EPS, okay, which is a side effect common to individuals who are being treated with antipsychotics. That can create a problem with dysfunctional body movement and change in muscle tone. So that's why bringing up some of these lower brain functions might be important. And we talk about EPS, you talk about things like Parkinsonism, dyskinesias, or dystonias. So these are abnormal movements, okay? In this case, of voluntary muscle, typically. Akathisia, or restlessness tardive dyskinesia, which is a category in of itself with dysfunctional movement, oftentimes, again, shuffling gait from the ambulation standpoint, pill rolling type of movements with the hands. Neck may be affected and turned over. There may be some tics or facial tics, or some very slow, methodical, dystonic type of movements, in effect, then too, we call it choreiform movements that are associated with that. That may be irreversible, and then again, that's secondary to side effects of certain types of antipsychotics we refer to as first-generation antipsychotics. So something just to make note of. We'll talk about that further in the future. Again, we fast-forwarded in class to neuron and neuronal tissue relative to nerves, okay, and looked at the basic structures, again, in this case, the cell body, the axons, and the dendrites, okay. Keeping in mind then, too, two different types of neurons that exist, the afferent or sensory, okay, that direct sensory impulses, okay, from your skin or from your other sensory organs to the central nervous system, i.e. to the spine and to the brain, or the efferent motor type neurons that direct commands, okay, for movement, okay, for everything that you do relative to coordinated movement. And then interneurons, neurons that sort of bridge these in between, bridge the afferent or efferent with the spinal column and then the brain. So what we really were emphasizing the other day was the neurochemistry and how psychiatric disorders are very much concerned with the way in which dysfunction in the synaptic regions is affected too, and in particular, okay, at either axon terminals, okay, that have unfortunately receptors, things that grab onto neurochemicals, the ones that we're going to be talking about or are interested in psychiatry, and how that can be influenced by a range of psychopathologies, and also, of course, influenced by medications that we may use to treat those psychopathologies. So receptors that are at the axon terminals, also receptors are at the dendrite terminals. So the synapse is in between. It's an area in which neurochemicals relay information, basically. And if that's influenced or affected, we can have problems. We can have problems with both physical and psychological pathologies or dysfunction. So that's important relative to understanding, again, typical neurological functioning versus dysfunctional or abnormal functioning. So within this, the neurotransmitters that go between, that are the messengers, and exist within these synapses that go between the neurons, the dendrite of one, the axon of another. We've got cholinergic acetylcholine. Okay, acetylcholine, critical for movement, but we also mentioned critical for memory, so hence we linked it a bit to dementia. There are the monoamines that we're really focusing on, in particular norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, as being critical messengers within the context of our both cognitive and emotional realities, and the way in which that exists and works, okay, within that limbic system, and principally within the frontal cortex, okay, of the brain, of the cerebrum. That's important. There are amino acids that we'll talk about too, one being GABA. That's critical. And again, it's just another type of messenger. These are all at one level derived from neuropeptides at one level. So they're protein related at one point. Okay, the amino acids obviously in particular, but GABA-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, and there's a couple others, glutamate and aspartate. We'll refer to those, but we won't talk about them at length. And then there's peptides themselves that act almost like neurohormones, substance P and somatostatin. Okay, and then one other variant from these that we did mention in class, monoamine oxidase, that also affects the way in which the monoamines of these neurotransmitters are affected at the level of the synapse between two neurons. So aside from receptors being affected and altered by medications, there may be medications that also alter the function of monoamine oxidase, and there's such a thing as MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, that when that shuts down that enzyme, it makes more of the monoamines, i.e. serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine in particular, to be available. Okay, so that's an important foundation information consideration. This was just a picture I had in class about neurotransmitter binding to receptors. And if you think about, again, the idea of not just synaptic transmission, but reuptake, okay, if we intervene to affect and inhibit reuptake at the level of the dendrite, okay, and that membrane, okay, presynaptic, okay, in effect then too, so that we don't have a normal recycling of monoamines like serotonin, like norepinephrine, like dopamine, that can affect in a positive way some psychopathology, such as depression and such as disordered thinking relative to schizophrenia even, in effect then too. But in particular with depression, we think about reuptake inhibition as being a critical type of process that can influence the mood state, that SSRIs, or serotonin reuptake inhibitors, can influence this whole notion about making more serotonin and norepinephrine in particular available in the synapse to cross again to the axon terminal and propagate a neuronal impulse. So for a depressed person, that really matters. So we'll talk more about that in effect then too, but that's an interesting concept that sort of works relative to this picture, so that's why I want to refer to it. Okay, so again, those neurotransmitters we're talking about just in generalities, acetylcholine in particular, associated with movement, but also associated with memory acquisition retention, so hence the link to dementia. Norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin we've already been focusing on, but these are really key relative to depression, mood disorders. Dopamine is also relevant, associated with psychosis and schizophrenia, and serotonin with depression and anxiety as well. Serotonin and norepinephrine are very closely related and linked, so you'll tend to see a lot of talk that it looks in parallel to those. Okay, histamine also involved, not nearly as integrally for our discussion. And GABA I mentioned before, an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Now, what does that mean, inhibitory? That slows things down. It slows down neurotransmission. The others, it'll depend upon the environment they're in, whether they're inhibitory or excitatory. Typically, they're excitatory. In this case, though, GABA is a clear inhibitory neurotransmitter. And again, we'll just refer to glutamate as one that's out there. Really, for deeper context, refer to your textbook. They do a nice job in that psychobiology lecture, but I'm focusing on the hot spots right now. And then some of those other substances we mentioned that are really just for reference purposes. They're certainly involved. The whole notion about psychopathology as it pertains to neurotransmission, and that includes that of all these peptide-based types of compound, and even those that act more as hormones than they do as messengers, so to speak, in terms of neurological functioning directly. They're all related. So I'm certainly, as I talk about their function, just emphasizing more important ones and glossing over some, because it's a very complex subject matter to which, in our class, we need to have an appreciation for it, but we're not going to have a detailed understanding. Refer to the book for a better, deeper context, but I think for our purposes, we're doing this justice. And then the enzyme we mentioned before, this whole notion about one other approach to affecting, again, monoamine levels within a synapse would be to affect an enzyme as opposed to affecting receptors, as we were talking about before, that analogy to reuptake inhibition. Okay. So hormones certainly are involved. They're part of it. We're focusing on neurotransmission with those monoamines and associated peptides. But by the same token, we'll refer to these only because they're relevant for certain states. In particular, I mentioned class thyroid stimulating hormone. We know that many individuals who are depressed also are hypothyroid. So that's important relative to understanding. Other considerations, the kindling effect. I'll just mention this briefly. I'll encourage you to read about this. This is relevant to panic disorder, PTSD, and even maybe in withdrawal, where we have neurotransmission occurring too rapidly, firing of nerve cells too quickly. And then genetics, we referred to the other day about how we're all susceptible at one level to psychopathology or psychiatric conditions, possibly because of genetic vulnerability, and that environmental factors or situations could support as triggers some of that vulnerability manifesting itself. So, okay, but we know that there's a strong brain disorder consideration for psychopathology, and that's important, that we are talking about a brain disorder. We're talking about a brain disease. Okay, so just refer to this. I gave a few examples of identified links to genetic susceptibility that research has verified already in terms of evidence base at this point. And I refer to the psychopathologies relative to these conditions, and even beyond, again, genetic considerations, some neuroanatomical considerations and functional considerations for schizophrenia, mood disorders, again, focusing on neurotransmission to a certain extent, neurochemistry, and the anxiety disorders as well. So this is just a brief overview. I mentioned at the end some of the imaging techniques that might elucidate brain functioning and how brain functioning may be characterized from the standpoint of dysfunction by some of these techniques. Okay, that's it for this overview of psychopathology. I thank you for your attention.